Hi, you're watching DNA Today, a multi-award winning genetics podcast where we explore everything to do with genetics, from CRISPR to rare diseases to new research. We have won the Science and Medicine Podcast Award for many years now. We have hundreds of episodes, and we really hope you enjoy these conversations where we dive into so many genetic concepts. I'm Kira Deneen, a certified genetic counselor and your host. Did you know genetic counselors can work for medical insurance companies? Stephanie Gandomi was one of the first. She's a licensed and board-certified genetic counselor with over 20 years of experience in medical genomics, including patient care, research, industry, insurance, which we're going to talk about a lot today, education, and more. Currently, she serves as the program director of the Masters of Science in Genetic Counseling at Southern California University of Health Sciences. Her previous roles in insurance include being the first genetic counselor at Blue Shield of California and the director of genetics at United Healthcare. So as he said, in this conversation, we're going to explore how genetic counselors can have a huge impact working for medical insurance companies. And shout out to Rebecca C. for recommending the topic of this episode. She's one of our lovely patrons. And she specifically said, you got to have Stephanie on for this episode. So Stephanie, thank you so much for making this episode a reality.
Thank you, Kara, for having me. I feel honored to be on your podcast today.
Yeah, I'm excited. I don't think we've ever really explored, or we definitely haven't explored, the genetic counseling aspect of working for a medical insurance company. What inspired your transition? You had a bunch of years experience in the clinical genetic counseling side. And then to say, hey, I want to work in the medical insurance industry. As we said, you're one of the first. So I imagine you didn't see other genetic counselors leading the way to be like, oh, inspire you to do that. What led you to want to have this role and this impact?
Well, I think when I went to grad school and became a genetic counselor, it was very common for genetic counselors to go into clinical practice and then, some were in research and some were moving into industry. There were a few genetic counselors that really started to pave the way working for lab benefit management companies and sort of online utilization management organizations. So when Blue Shield of California approached me to take on that position as the first genetic counselor in their insurance company, as well as within all of the other Blue systems, it was a huge shift because they didn't know what a genetic counselor was, and I didn't really know what they needed me to do. So we spent a little bit of time trying to figure out where to best position me within the organization to make the most impact. So, immediately, actually, within a few weeks, we discovered, where the role should actually be and where we should be putting our efforts. And then it just kind of flourished from there.
So where did you end up going in terms of developing and implementing medical policies? I'm imagining, like you're saying, that it took a little bit to figure out how can you be most effective. So where did this lead you?
Yeah, so actually when I was first hired at Blue Shield of California, the role was to help really drive medical policy. But within a few weeks, we discovered some significant overutilization and incorrect coding that was taking place. And so suddenly I became involved in some recoupments and investigations that ended up actually, producing opportunities for healthcare cost of savings, as well as opportunities to then take that savings back and use it for medical policies that needed to be opened up. So I think in the beginning, no one really knew or realized what was actually happening within the system because genetics was so new. So it ended up starting out with, well, we know we have a problem. We know that genetics is growing, but we don't really know what the problem is or how to manage it. And as we dug into the data, we were able to find that overutilization or waste was causing a lot of the unnecessary spending for the payer. And then we actually, once we kind of got that under control, we were able to take those resources back and really use it for the patient care that needed it the most.
Wow. So just being able to really look at where you're allocating funds almost and being able to shift, okay, we should be spending more here, cutting back there. I imagine this is tough to balance the need for cost containment, right? To say, okay, where can we save? But also ensuring patient access to essential genetic testing and services like genetic counseling, right? We're both genetic counselors. How do you strike that balance? Because genetic testing itself, the price has dropped a lot of sequencing over the decades. But this is a test that often is done once that then can be utilized for the rest of someone's life. But I imagine that's hard for an insurance company because a lot of times insurance companies only have someone for X amount of years. They don't necessarily financially, it doesn't behoove them to do a test that's going to impact the patient's life. It's more of the next few years. So how does that all play a role in figuring out, okay, we need to approve this type of testing? I don't know, like I would find that very challenging.
It is. It's very challenging to take a step back and say, fundamentally, as much as I know insurance companies have a bad reputation at times and they, people joke that they just like to deny everything. I think that, at the end of the day, there still are only a limited amount of resources available for patient care. And so, assuming all good intent, that money has to be used where it's most needed. So if we think in genetics, patients who have diagnoses, have rare disease, those areas are the ones that, perhaps need the most amount of resources. And the evidence is really backing the use of testing or those diagnostic tools for patient care. So when you start to look, take that step back, look at it from a big picture standpoint and think about, okay, where can we make the cuts and where can we reallocate those resources to the patients or to the types of conditions that need it the most, then that's kind of the spirit of how a healthier insurance system really should be working. Once those allocations occur and we start to see that the reduction in some areas leads to open access in others, that's the balance you're trying to strike, right? And so we felt really proud about our program that we started at Blue Shield of California because ultimately that was the intent, was where can we reduce cost, but then increase quality of life, quality of care for the patients who need it the most. And, although it's easy to think, well, if we just cut costs or deny everything, it's going to save us money. We actually found the opposite to be true. So once we started cutting out the fraud and the abuse and the overutilization, and we were able to open up new policies, even in policies like exome and genome sequencing, where people thought, oh my goodness, or panel testing for that matter, people thought, well, we're going to end up just getting flooded or spending a significant amount of money on these tests. That wasn't actually the case, especially if you had in-network labs and you had appropriate utilization. We saw that it was really a nice, steady, healthy influx of claims, and we were able to get the patients the care that they needed. So the quality of life ultimately went up as a result.
And I would think too with that, you're potentially shortening the diagnostic odyssey where you're spending so much money in other types of tests. But if doing either a panel years ago or nowadays probably more an exome, sometimes a genome, if that gives you the answer quickly, then aren't you saving so much money? And potentially if there's some kind of treatment for that condition, then you're also saving money on these treatments that are not working and just going right to what's going to be the most effective. So I would think in the very long term, definitely makes sense. But you're saying even in a more medium short term, it also made sense financially. Like obviously we want to benefit everybody, by doing.
For sure. Absolutely. And I think that, we quickly realized when we started tracking our data that not only did we see immediate change, like literally, within months, 6 months, there was a tangible change in the spend, but then there was actually a steady increase in testing access in areas where we knew it was evidence-based and that testing really did need to grow. It led us to eventually we dug deeper into the use of rapid exome and rapid genome in the NICU because, to your point, if you're spending $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 a day on NICU costs, we saw a lot of data from Rady Children's Hospital about how the use of exome and genome and rapid exome and genome in the NICU could create alternative options for these families, for these patients. And so, again, it comes down to what can provide cost savings, but even more so, what is better? What's better management, better care, better treatment for patients? And that was ultimately an area that we really focused on. And I think we were really proud of the work that we did there because it was meaningful and impactful, and it changed people's lives.
And did you find it was challenging to convince and educate your coworkers at Blue Cross of just, okay, this is why we need to do this? Was there some pushback at the beginning before you were able to do it and see results to be like, hey, this is working? Because from a genetic counseling perspective, we see how valuable genetic testing is and how it can do all the things you're saying. But sometimes it can be a tough sell when you first say how much testing can cost at the beginning.
For sure. I mean, I still remember, well, first of all, you have to think that I was the first and only genetic counselor in that entire office, that entire building, right? For quite some time. So, most people didn't even know what a genetic counselor was, much less, why they should listen to what I had to say. So I had to, kind of earn my stripes, so to speak, for a little bit to finally get a seat at the table to be able to share, the expertise that I brought, but that we all as genetic counselors have to the discussion. So once I gained some credibility, and of course, there were many medical directors there that were essentially in charge of medical policy and claims adjudication. I used to joke that I would actually spend more time with my counseling skills rather than the actual molecular skills in that role, because I spent time just trying to build relationships with the medical directors and, with the business people to try to have them help just give me an opportunity to share my perspective. Once that happened, once we broke down some of those early barriers, then you would start to listen to where were the areas that they were stuck. For example, panel testing. When I started, a lot of the medical directors loved single gene or mini panels, but large hereditary cancer panels, I remember being told, oh, those are evil. we don't like large panels, right? And I thought, oh boy, we have some work to do here. And, I couldn't just come in and say, you're wrong, you should be covering these panels. It became more of a relationship building exercise. And then over time, bringing the data, showing them, having the in-network labs, which was an important part of this process, right? Really working collaboratively with the labs and having them share their data also with the medical directors is what ultimately, moved the needle. And so it was a fun time. And I still think it's going on today. There are genetic counselors who are continuing that same work, and it's an important role to have within the insurance industry.
How exciting that you were able to be, as we said, one of the first genetic counselors. You were the first at Blue Cross of California, but in general, one of the first working directly at a medical insurance company and moving the needle with this. Were there other misconceptions that you had to demystify or other obstacles that you experienced with that? I got to educate them on this because they're a little bit misinformed or something that, understandably, because, when you were doing this, I imagine a lot of the people you were working with weren't necessarily trained in genetics, and especially older doctors and healthcare providers and other people on the team probably didn't learn a lot about genetics when they were going through their education.
No, very, very true. And I think that probably is actually still true today, even for both insurance companies that have genetic counselors working for them and those companies that don't. We love the physicians that play these roles, that work for insurance companies. We're glad that they're there because at least, their patient advocacy skills and their medical skills are critical to making sure that medical policy coverage is aligned with standards of care. But obviously, as we all know, most physicians, especially physicians who maybe graduated from medical school 10, 20, 40 plus years ago, didn't have much genetic education. And so I think that there were many medical directors for us that were very, eager to learn and others that were resistant and felt like, well, this is not FDA approved, or this doesn't have any regulatory oversight. And so it's the Wild West. And so, why should we cover this testing? Because it's really all experimental and research. So some of that, we have to break down those barriers. And that was where the help from the labs, the in-network labs, the good partner labs was really beneficial in working together to break that down. And as much as you didn't want it to ever feel like a them versus us or an us versus them type of culture, we had to actually break down some of those preconceptions or those misconceptions, because there had been so much fraud, waste, and abuse taking place in the genetics industry for so long that, rightfully so, many medical directors and health insurance companies were feeling overwhelmed and threatened by the increasing claims, especially when claims were being submitted that shouldn't have been submitted in the first place, right? So we had to kind of clean up. Again, it was a lot of like psychosocial dynamics that needed to be adjusted and cleaned up in order to then get to business and to say, okay, let's put all of our baggage aside. Let's put all of this, what this lab did to me or what we did to this lab aside and say, let's work together. And I think that since I came from a background in the lab space and having worked with some highly reputable labs in the past before going to the insurance industry, I was able to bring those relationships to the table and have good, healthy, constructive conversations that broke down so many barriers. And that was really what led us to a lot of progress from a policy standpoint and from an access to care standpoint.
I imagine having those companies become a network also is a huge bonus, and just being able to work out those type of relationships and like contracts being involved, because as you said, I think there used to be a lot more of that, I would say the word fraud of some labs charging more than they really should or need to, from my limited experience in this. But I still see and hear about it from colleagues today of, this non-invasive prenatal screening of, the patient was charged $100, but then that company went around and charged then the insurance company $20,000. And I'm like, how is that So I'm just shocked that this is not something that is just in the past, but is currently happening. And I think some companies that will remain nameless have a reputation for doing that more than others. Is this, I don't know, like how do we navigate that kind of spanning out now? And just in terms of us as genetic counselors, how can we better advocate so that we don't have those issues that are just going to snowball and cause insurance companies to double down and be like, we're not covering this because it's going to end up being tens of thousands, when from my perspective, I don't understand why it's that much for something like non-invasive prenatal screening.
It's a tough question. I think that, it's a multi-layered issue, right? We fundamentally have some truly broken parts of our healthcare system, and the insurance industry as a whole, has definitely opportunities for change and growth. And, so you've got that core issue that isn't just unique to genetics. It's probably unique to every part of healthcare as a whole, right? And then we have access to care issues, and then we have, then you throw on COVID on top of that, and all of the healthcare expenditure that came from a national health crisis and inpatient. I mean, it just gets super complicated. And even though genetic testing as a whole is such a tiny little drop in the bucket of everything that an insurance company spends in a year on healthcare, I think it actually got a little extra hype, especially when we look at the news articles that were coming out over the last, 5-10 years regarding healthcare insurance fraud. And we saw some of the CMS, fraud cases that occurred. And so everybody suddenly went into panic about genetics. At the end of the day, I don't think genetics turned out or is turning out to be as big of a concern or a problem for insurance companies as maybe they thought it was going to be. And I think now with some of the shift that's occurring with labs and consolidation of labs and labs going out of business, some of that's naturally taking care of itself. But I'm not sure it's a problem that we're going to be able to solve with just one solution. I think it's something that's going to require solutions from a variety of different angles. Contracting at a local level, your network, your contract, your partnerships with your labs that are in network is so critical to just your own local health. So if you're at one health plan, whether you're the medical director or the genetic counselor or the contracting, lead at that health plan, making sure that you're utilizing high quality labs, making sure that your network is really tight and that you're as many claims or patients to those high quality labs is key, right? Because the way we used to look at it from an insurance company is if we want to make sure that the testing is going to the right person at the right time and is in accordance with medical policy, then we want to make sure we're having the physicians in our network using the labs that we feel comfortable with. And truly those higher quality labs were, no one's perfect and people make mistakes with their billing, but they generally were not the labs committing insurance fraud most of the time, right? And I know every name has probably at some point, perked up a little with some claims questions, but for the most part, a lot of the really bad actors have gone away or are starting to go away or will go away in time just because simply that type of claims behavior is not sustainable. So, really big on good, solid in-network contracts and having those partnerships and those relationships. And I think that's truly the best you can do at this point, even in a somewhat broken overall system.
Yeah, that makes sense. And especially, I highlighted that there are companies charging too much, but then there's also genetic testing companies that I think are not charging enough that then make it hard for these other companies that are also providing really high quality care or testing that leads to high quality care. And then it's like, well, let's go with the cheaper company. And then it's like, no, we need to charge more because we can't keep the genetic testing industry alive by doing that. So I think it's both sides, that there's so many issues on charging too much, not charging enough, and different issues within the field that it leads to. I wanted to ask you too about, especially for the clinical genetic counselors listening or healthcare providers that end up fighting for something to be covered for their patients. So you have so much experience in countless areas of healthcare, right? We talked about you have the clinical genetic counseling experience. You've been on the research side. You've worked in industry. So you've worked for some of these labs that, we've talked about. Obviously, in the insurance side, you're also a program director now in education. So you have really gone in so many different areas, which really provides a well-rounded perspective in all these different areas, right? So what I want to know from all of this experience that you have, what is your advice for genetic counselors to successfully advocate for patients when it comes to navigating insurance coverage for genetic testing? So we get a letter from an insurance company that says, oh, we've denied coverage for this. And then the genetic counselor, like myself, I'll be like, all right, it's time to write a letter of medical necessity. Are there aspects that you think we should be including in these letter of medical necessity or other things we should be doing to try to get testing that we need to be covered? Because maybe we don't know someone like you to contact at the company to be like, hey, Stephanie, I need your help to be like, that this is legit and needs to be covered. But how can clinic genetic counselors do this?
No, that's an excellent question. I think that all of us working together, again, from all the different angles is really going to be the key to getting that access to care for those patients, right? Whether it be at the policy level or even at an individual patient level. And of course, the clinical genetic counselor, the genetic counselor that's seeing the patient plays a significant role in that as well. So, one of the things that when I worked in market access, we would say to clinical genetic counselors and physicians is please send medical records. We need those medical records, right? So that's, even something as simple as just submitting the medical records, getting the prior authorization, making sure that you're ordering testing from in-network providers, those types of activities can be some of the most important critical first steps. And then, if you're using a lab that's in network, that's highly reputable, that has testing that's covered by medical policy, and the patient that you're sending that sample for meets that criteria, then, often there should be payment for that, should be coverage for that, especially if prior authorization's in place and all of the medical records were sent. I think sometimes where it starts to go a little bit south is when that claim gets submitted to the insurance company and either something was incomplete or the insurance company made a mistake, a genuine mistake, or the prior auth wasn't obtained. And now everyone's trying to figure out how to get that covered. I think there was a time where letters of medical necessity were important. I'm not sure so much how impactful those really are. I think a lot of labs will often help with the letter of medical necessity. It really fundamentally comes down to medical records. That's often why claims get denied. But working with your market access, team at your favorite lab is such an important way to help your patient, right? Because usually that market access team, that billing team, knows how to work with that insurance company, right? And they have all of the processes in place, and they have all of the information about what's needed in order to, under the right circumstance, to get that test covered. So I think what we've said to other, clinical counselors in the past is, instead of trying to spin your own wheels too much and waste a lot of your time on phone calls and talking with, customer service at the insurance company, work collaboratively with the billing team at the lab, work collaboratively with the team, the market access team. And maybe it's a claim that has to get, managed or covered, but then you can also work together on the policy. If there's an aspect of the policy that needs to be adjusted, your voices are often, clinical GC voices are often way more powerful to an insurance company from a standard of care medical policy angle than a lab, because often, even though the lab may have some data that's valuable or may be able to speak articulately about the technology, but it often gets perceived as that they're really pushing policy change as a conflict of interest, right, to make money. But if the clinical genetic counselor goes to bat for not only that patient, but for the policy as a whole, then it has a completely different energy behind it. And it's coming much more from an advocacy standpoint. And I think that's really where GCs can work together, both with GCs within the system, but also, within the lab system, but also with GCs in the healthcare.
That is so helpful. Well. Really appreciate you sharing that, because honestly, before I asked that, I figured, letter of medical necessity, like that's the number one thing. And you're like, so like that is really helpful to be like, hey, let's make sure they have all of the medical records that are relevant to this. And then, as you said, I've done this before, of working kind of in reaching out to my sales rep and saying, hey, can you connect me with the billing people? Because I think they can be helpful. And they really have been, because they want to get paid. So they're motivated to work with you so that the insurance company is reimbursing them or paying them. So that is just so helpful for people that it's possible you zoned out or walked away from your speaker. Come back and go back to Stephanie's answer there, because that is gold. That is amazing. And one thing that you mentioned in terms of like pushing for better policies and those aspects, from my limited understanding, it seems like we as genetic professionals need to make sure that our organizations like NSGC, ACOG, like I'm in the prenatal space, right? Chakra, I've said that a couple of times now, but all of these, different organizations to have good policy, like position statements, so that then Medicare, Medicaid has the right policies, because then it seems like whatever policies those are seems to have a trickle down effect on these private insurance companies, that they take a look at Medicare or Medicaid, what they're doing, and say, oh, okay, maybe we'll follow suit with that. Am I getting that process right? Can you kind of clarify and better explain what we can do as genetic counselors to have this impact and how the downstream effects work?
Absolutely. I think it's not a one size fits all process or, a consistent recipe across all payers. I think in general that what happens at the Medicaid and Medicare level is definitely noticed by the commercial payers and vice versa to some degree. And there's a lot of change taking place, especially at the CMS level for coverage. And now with FDA regulations coming, looming, it's going to be interesting to watch how that looks. But I do think that commercial payers definitely do pay attention to what Medicare covers and what Medicaid covers. and takes that into consideration. Sometimes it's enough to move the needle and sometimes it's just not. They want to see more evidence or they want to see, additional studies. So it kind of varies pair by pair. I will say though, I think in general, again, making a very general statement, that having pairs with genetic counselors working for them is pretty significant and is a major catalyst for medical policy change, because this material, this evidence, this data, these peer review literature publications are often extremely hard to digest. Even for us as GCs, some of them are highly complicated, and being able to at least translate that into, some sort of digestible presentation internally to the medical directors, or having them at least get some, in a nutshell version of what this actually means for patient care, can be extremely valuable, especially if you as a genetic counselor internally within the insurance company are advocating for that change, right? And so what we've seen as a result of that are some payers are actually ahead of the game because they have genetic counselors working for them, like United Healthcare. And those genetic counselors have been able to work and advocate for patients, and they've been able to move the needle and get coverage for things like whole genome and, that maybe even CMS or other payers are currently not covering today. So I think it comes again from a bunch of different angles, but there's so many ways that GCs can be involved in making this change.
Wow. I think that is just so inspirational too for people that are listening on the insurance side that might be hiring genetic counselors to be like, yeah, I think this makes sense. I think we need someone like Stephanie on our team to figure all of this out and be really efficient with how it's done. But also for genetic counselors listening, especially the ones that are earlier in their career, but honestly, even the ones in the middle of their career that have a lot of experience like you, that are like, hey, I want to do something different in the field, use my skills in a different way and have a really big impact. Do it. Check it out. I mean, hopefully there's job postings for this, but also like our, ancestor genetic counselors that started our field by going to doctors being like, you need me. This is why. So I think that's just, it's so valuable and just the huge impact you can have with it. Before I let you go, I have to switch gears with my last question. So you're the program director at a newly accredited program. So congrats on that. I hear it is quite a feat to get that done. So that's at Southern California University of Health Science. And you were also one of the co-founders at Boise. And they, I believe, were the first online genetic counseling program, fully online. So for prospective genetic counseling students listening, we have a lot of them. So if I don't ask you this, people are going to be like, how did you have a program director on and not ask? What advice do you have for people that are applying to your program or others, just in terms of being a standout applicant and getting that interview invite?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, just to clarify, because I don't ever want to be inaccurate, we have received our candidacy approval by ACGC, and we're now in the process of getting our full the new program approval, hopefully soon. So knock on wood, that will come hopefully in the next few months. We're optimistic. But, I think it's been such a fun journey, not only having such a diverse background myself, but then being able to bring that to the next generation of genetic counselors. And so it's extremely rewarding to be a program director today, especially for an online program where we are able to attract students from a variety of different backgrounds and have different professional interests. I think that diversification of your skill set, using your genetic counseling training as your foundation, but then also, being a lifelong learner, adding additional skills. I went back and got training in coding and in compliance, because that became really important skills to have at the insurance company. So never stop learning and think about where can you take your expertise and start new jobs, right? And so my advice to students today is, if you come in and you're looking to pursue a very traditional genetic counseling role, then we will be there to support that. And we commend that. And we need genetic counselors in clinic, and we need genetic counselors in research. But we also need genetic counselors in areas that we don't even know exist today. And I think that's kind of what I fell into with the Blue Shield of California role, was they were hiring for a nurse. They didn't know what a genetic counselor was. So the job description had been out there in the universe for a while, and it never said the word genetic counselor in it. And I think that many jobs where genetic counselors would be ideal for don't maybe even have the title or the words genetic counselor in them. So I think our students, that's something we're going to be driving home with our new cohorts when they get ready to look for jobs, is that you essentially can be anything you want. You can go out there and do anything you want within the healthcare field or Kira, as you do in communications and media, right? But it's still impactful. It still has that kind of connection back to genetic counseling. And I think there's so much change that we still need to make in insurance. And so I hope that our future students will really take that opportunity and jump on it, because we have so much more work to do. And so I look forward to seeing what happens with the next generation.
Yeah, but thank you so much for being the one that started the work in directly working within the insurance companies, because someone has to be the first, right? So that we can all make it even better. So just thank you so much for all of this insight. I think it's just so fascinating. And I completely agree that I'm always poking around for jobs, usually not for myself, but more for my mentees and recent grads and all that. And I'm like, don't just look at jobs labeled genetic counselor, because there's so many. I know, like, marketing is always interesting to me. And that's something that they won't necessarily say it, but you read the job description, you're like, oh, I have all these skills as a genetic counselor and the expertise in genetics to bring into this role. So I really encourage that, especially for people that are, out there and maybe they just graduated, this past cycle. And so, yeah, thank you so much, Stephanie. This was really enlightening. And thank you for so much that you've done in the field. My goodness, it's like, I can't even say it in one breath. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And best of luck with, thank you for correcting me on the program and everything. Best of luck as you guys get going with it.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity, and, absolutely anytime, and welcome any student contact too. So thank you.
Thanks for watching DNA Today. To access all of our episodes, head over to dnatoday.com. We also have a lot of bonus content on there that you can enjoy. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, guest pitches, you name it, send them in to info@dnatoday.com. We'd also really appreciate if you could take a moment to rate and review the podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to the show. It really helps more nerds like yourself find the show. Also, if you like giveaways and other ways to connect with us, I recommend following us on social. We're at DNA Today Podcast. We also have a Patreon if you want to be the most level involved in the show. That's also at DNA Today Podcast. Thank you so much for listening and watching. Join us next time to learn and discover new advances in the world of genetics.